Outraged, Turkey accuses the United States of siding with an outlawed Kurdish armed group. But Washington says the YPG is crucial in defeating ISIL in Syria. So how will the Allies heal this latest rift? And how will it impact the war in Syria? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, Turkey calls them terrorists. The US sees them as allies against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Kurdish forces in Syria have been working with the US Army for months now. But Turkey found out this week that American troops have been wearing the Kurdish militia's insignia, and they're not at all happy about it. US troops say they were merely wearing it to blend in.
The Special Forces community has a long and proud history of wearing such patches when they're partnering with forces around the world. And you'll see examples of that in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in Latin America and all over the world where these Special Forces personnel train and conduct foreign internal defense type operations. This is something that they often do, and it's an effort to just kind of connect with those that they're training. But the fact of the matter is, it's not authorized. So in this case, they were directed to remove the patches.
But Turkey's foreign minister was not at all convinced.
Suriye'nin diğer bölgelerine gittiği zaman
we advise them to wear the insignia of Daesh al-Nusra and al-Qaeda when they go to other regions in Syria. They can even wear the insignia of Boko Haram when they go to Africa. If they say we don't see the YPG and these terrorist groups as the same, my answer is that this is a double standard and two-faced.
So why is Turkey so concerned about the YPG? Well, it's a militia group made up mostly of Syrian Kurds, and they're one of the most effective groups fighting against ISIL in Syria right now. But Turkey says it's an extension of the banned PKK that's been fighting for Kurdish autonomy for 3 decades within Turkey. Now, Turkey and most Western countries list the PKK as a terrorist organisation. And Turkey says that makes the YPG a terrorist group as well. All right, let's bring in our guests now. From Istanbul, we have Metin Gurcan, a former Turkish military officer. He's also a columnist for Al Monitor. In London, we have Rebwar Fatah, founder and managing director of Middle East Consultancy. In New York, we have Lyons, a senior fellow at the Truman National Security Project. Thank you all, gentlemen. But Mike, can I start with you as a former military man? What do you make of this incident? Is this just a regular, a fairly innocuous incident that is being blown out of all proportion?
I think it is. It's not that big a deal. You see that actually that American soldier was wearing the patch of the YPJ, which is the Women's Liberation Unit that's there. So he'd have no real affiliation with that on any level. The Americans that are there are wearing American flags. They're clearly been identified based on those pictures. I think it's being blown out. It does send a message, though. It sends a message to Turkish civilians that Americans are embedded with these units, as well as the Turkish military, to say if you decide to launch an artillery attack against any of these units, you might hit an American soldier. And that, I think that's the underlying symbol that maybe that Special Forces unit wanted to send. OK, and Rebwar in London, fundamental to this, of course, is how you deem the YPG. Ankara insists that Syria's Kurdish group, the YPG, is linked inextricably, it would appear, to the Turkish insurgent group, the PKK. How true is that? Is there a link between the two organizations?
I mean, there might be links between the two organizations, but you cannot really label the entire people, Kurdish people in Syria as terrorist people, because don't forget, YPG has 25,000 fighters fighting on the ground and fighting ISIS. And if Turkey wants to call every single, soldier of these as a terrorists is really very, very strange to me. But I think that the Turks have fundamental problem. Their fundamental problem is the Kurdophobia. If there is any Kurdish political group anywhere on this planet, they try to undermine it and they call it terror and so on. But I think that's the Turkish problem, not really the Kurdish problem. And the facts on the ground is very clear. YPG is the only effective group that fighting ISIS, and it is true that America is assisting, I don't want to say partnering, but assisting YPG. There's no doubt about that. And there is no doubt about that the Ankara facilitates for ISIS or ISIL to have fighters to support and get money and so on. So
but that's a very controversial claim, though, isn't it? To suggest that Ankara, because it is so anti-Kurd, that it would side with ISIL.
I don't say would fight with ISIS, but all the objective evidence supports that Ankara facilitated in early days, maybe not now, for insurgents to move through Turkish land into Syria to join ISIS, and there is no doubt there was money handed to ISIS leaders in Turkey, and their objective evidence also supports that ISIS leaders were treated, wounded ones, treated in Turkey.
All right, okay. Can we leave Turkey's view of ISIL to one side for now? Because Metin in Istanbul, what this incident does show us, it would appear, is a level of mistrust between Ankara and the United States, not to mention between the other parties involved in this complex web of fighting forces trying to get rid of ISIL.
Yes, it's a matter of distrust, but I have to emphasize this fact as well. It's an ontological debate between Ankara and Washington. I mean, if you look at the traditional history of bilateral relationship between Ankara and Washington, we see a consent with Ankara and Washington about the definition of terrorist and definition of terrorism. But right now, for instance, those YPG guys fighting against ISIS in northern Syria, are they freedom fighters, or are they the guardians of the Western civilization in the fight against ISIS? Or are they? Yes, that's right.
Just because they are Kurds,
are they terrorists?
Well, just because they are Kurds, they are not. Not every single Kurd is a terrorist. They are. This is the fact on the ground. There's a political entity in Syria, in northern Syria, which has gained to some extent international recognition, and we have seen how effective they are fighting against terrorists, ISIS, and that's the only group that America can rely on. Whatever Ankara's view is on this is really irrelevant, and we have seen that Washington is helping and partnering with this group, and this group in the last few days shown they are very, very effective to move into Raqqa, which is the de facto capital of ISIS.
Indeed.
And if Ankara is not relies on that, what do? They have no option.
Can I take that point?
Realize their foreign policy.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. Can I take that point, put it to Mike, because it is a fact, isn't it, that on the ground, the only effective force, it would appear, against ISIL right now is the YPG, is the Kurdish-led forces, and the Americans have been accused of being politically tone-deaf insofar as their handling of the situation. As we've already said, it's a myriad, it's a patchwork of different entities.
Well, that might be the case, but the Americans' perspective right now is first things first. General Votel just went to Syria a few weeks ago and reinforced that to the special operators on the ground there, and they feel that with the YPG and the Syrian Democratic Force, the SDF, both together are having success on the ground tactically. So I think the U.S. is blinders on right now, trying to take advantage of momentum they have on the ground to go after ISIS in Raqqa. That's not happened before. So I think that's where America is looking at this as saying short-term gain for perhaps long-term pain and long-term reconciliation with Turkey. But right now, the success on the ground is trumping all of those things.
And does it matter then, Metin, this association or not between YPG in northern Syria and PKK possibly in Turkey. Does it matter when actually on the ground the military objective is, it would appear, succeeding?
It's impossible. I mean, it's extremely important for us to have an offensive force in the fight against ISIS. But the real problem, I think, for Ankara is the transfer of those highly technical military equipment and the military knowledge the YPG guys gathered or gained in Syria, from Syria into Turkey. You know, in Turkey we have ongoing clashes in southeastern Turkey. Right now, I think this is Ankara's strategic thinking to prevent by sealing the border, by separating YPG means and ways from the ongoing clashes in southeastern Turkey. That's why Ankara has been very, very careful on this issue.
So it would appear that there are priorities being made and that Ankara is prioritizing its own domestic issue in dealing with a Kurdish insurgency over and above the fight against ISIL.
That's right, that's right. This is the point that I want to emphasize, re-emphasize. If you remember my ontological debate issue, I want to emphasize this. As I said you before, I mean, 10 years ago, there was a consent between Washington and Ankara about the definition of terror and terrorism. But right now we see, because of these differentiating prioritizations and differentiating political entities in Syria, as far as we see, Ankara has different future for Syria, has been designing a different or planning a different future for Syria, and Washington's future of Syria is a different design. So this differentiation surely have reflections on the ground. So, as I said to you before, the fight against ISIS should be prioritized in Syria. This is my own thinking. But this conceptual and definitional problems between Ankara and Washington should be addressed immediately, because I can say that if you look at the tactical facts on the ground, we are losing time in the fight against ISIS because of this extremely politicized issues.
And Rebwar in London, it would appear that much of the fear, if you like, the concern, the preoccupation in Ankara about the YPG is about the level of territory that it's managed to secure and that it currently controls for itself. And it's concerned, perhaps understandably, about this feeding into and bolstering what it considers to be a terrorist threat on its own doorstep, within its own territory.
Well, there is a fundamental problem with Turkey, is Kurdophobia. There is no any other problem. Turkey must wake up to the modern world. They must realize there are about 25 to 30 million Kurds in southeast Turkey, and they must be granted their cultural and linguistic rights. To date, Ankara is denying this. Now, there's a political entity in northern Iraq that Ankara cannot do anything about it. And there is also another political entity which is emerging since 2011, and it has gained very well international recognition. We have seen all these beautiful ladies fighting ISIS without fear. There is no any other definition to this that fits the terror that Ankara defines, except they are Kurds. If they were something else, if they were Arab, Assyrians, Turkoman, whatever, they would have never been labeled terrorists. But now Ankara tried to tell me that there are about 4 or 5 million Kurds in Turkey, and they have 25,000 fighters fighting terror in Syria, and they're trying to establish a peaceful political entity. They have not constituted any threat to any land anywhere in the region, neither in Turkey. And Ankara, it's just really the Kurdophobia of Ankara they must get over. Probably Ankara could have offer the nation, its nation, a better
I think that
service
might be the subject of another debate, actually. That might be for another programme, but thank you very much. Now, Mike, so we seem to appear to have differing priorities, if you like, between Ankara and the United States, but the United States is relying heavily, isn't it, upon the cooperation, to a degree, of Ankara?
No question, it has to, but the United States also has a long-standing relationship with the Kurds going back to 1990s at the end of Desert Storm, and those relationships have gone on for a long time, and recognizes that the Kurds are tremendous fighters, tremendous warriors. The United States introduces night sights and GPS systems and tactical advantages to give them in order to fight ISIS, and they've been successful. So I think the U.S. is looking, again, short-term, trying to defeat ISIS where it can, and possibly punting to the next administration, the next president, in order to figure out how the U.S. and Turkey can realign their goals of Turkey, for example, having Assad out, and then also coming up with perhaps a better collective security agreement against Russia, all kinds of things that the U.S. and Turkey still need to work on, and they need to get through this short-term pain for right now, though.
And Metin, does this in some way explain the accusations against Ankara of it having a fairly ambivalent approach to the war against ISIL? It sees the Syria problem only being solved by the removal of President Assad. It doesn't necessarily want to be involved in piecemeal operations, taking out one group or siding with another group. It wants the whole country delivered without Assad.
That's right. I totally agree with you. But let me remind this. Last week, after the government replacement in Turkey, I think we can see some much more pragmatic and realist U-turns in Turkey's Syria policy. I'm expecting that. And also, I have to emphasize this issue. I accept our friends in London, his, Kurdophobia argument. This is necessary part to explain the whole dilemma, but it's not sufficient, I think. I have to re-emphasize the geostrategic importance of this Aziz-Munbic line and its north. I call that area north of Aziz-Munbic line as Jarablus pocket. At the end of the day, we see that the force controlling this area, this territory, will control or determine the end of Syria, the future of Syria, and the one controlling this area will have a great say in the future of region. So that's why we see at the tactical level, at the regional level, at the global level, this sort of strategic confusion in the region. But as traditional allies, I think Ankara and Washington should address this issue very realistically. And as I said to you before, I'm expecting some realist U-turns of Ankara after the government's replacement, because President Erdogan's U-turns in this sort of issues is a well-known fact.
And Rebwar in London, it seems very much as though the tentative peace deal that was in effect in Turkey between the PKK and the Ankara government, that seemed to end pretty suddenly around the same time as the Suruj bombing of July last year. Now, that was apparently carried out by ISIL against Kurdish targets. Why are these two events so similarly timed? Are they linked?
I think ISIS is very clever in exploiting the situation. I think they did the same thing in Saudi Arabia. If they want to strain the relationship between Kurds and Turks in Turkey, they will bomb Kurds. Then the Kurds can blame the Turks for that. I mean, that's no doubt about that. But the strategic position that the Turkey, as a very, very important nation in the region, should take, should not undermine ethnicity, should undermine violence and terror. But currently, anything related to Kurds is labeled terror. And it's not really only the PKK. HDP, one of the main Turkish political entities, which is Kurdish-led by Salahuddin Çelik, are under great pressure from Turkey. This is a legitimate political entity, and still AKP try to, I don't say Turkey, I say AKP try to undermine this political entity and label terror.
But the government, the Turkish government would also cite recent bombings that have taken place in Turkey itself that have been attributed to Kurdish armed groups. So they would use that as argument for their cracking down on what they consider to be extremists.
You see, it's like there is a hole in my pocket, there lays there. It's like that. if Turkey takes the Kurdish issue seriously as an issue of an ethnic group, not treated as a security threat. The Kurdish issue is not a security threat. It's a legitimate grievance of an ethnic group in Turkey that have been oppressed for years. Not now. It starts last century, around when the Turkish state.
Okay.
But it is this is my last word of advice to Turkey. If they really want to have a say in the future of Syria, not Turkey, in Syria, they should align with the Kurdish groups and they should facilitate in order to neutralize them, even if there is any link with the PKK as they label as a terrorist organization. Maybe with their help they can eliminate. But now all they do is labeling Kurds.
All right, that's an interesting point.
Terrorists.
An interesting point you make. And Mike, what do you think of that point? That any success in Syria has got to entail a certain collaboration between the Turks and the Kurdish forces on the ground, as well, of course, with the rest of the US-led coalition.
They have to get in the game. They just can't assume that the US, the Kurds, will take care of this fight and then try to insert themselves later in the process. They won't have the legitimacy to do that. Even though they're in the region, they're obviously not going anywhere from a geographic perspective. But you look at history and you look at what's happened in the past, the issue to overcome is what happens to the Kurdish people. What does happen inside of Syria? If you want a solution for the future of Syria and that part of the world, you have to get in the game now, put skin in the game, so to speak. I think that's why America is doing what it's doing when it sent 300 soldiers there, in order to have a say from a security perspective to make sure that one country doesn't have overall hegemony within the region.
Metin, you indicated or alluded to the possibility of there being a change in policy coming from Ankara, given the change at the top of the AK party, a new prime minister now in place.
Yes, I'm expecting this sort of change, but let me emphasize this important fact. You know, what we need in the fight against ISIS is a clearly cut, comprehensive strategy, first to diminish ISIS in Syria and then to defeat it. So the formation of an offensive ground force is the first step of all these efforts. So I mean, after capture of Raqqa or Deir ez-Zor, ISIS-held territories, how can we hold those, areas? Then how can we rebuild? How can we proceed to that post-conflict reconstruction phase? So it's important that we need a strategy, very comprehensive strategy. I call it, in the fight against ISIS, this strategy is bombing and talking strategy. We know who to bomb and why to bomb. There are no, there are no, how can I say, missing points in these two processes. But what about the talking issue? And the most important point is how to synchronize these two. When to bomb and when to talk with those Sunni Arab power structures right now currently under the control of ISIS, and how to integrate those for the future of Syria. These are, I think, important points.
Can I ask you just one question, Metin, and I need a very short answer to this. Do you anticipate, therefore, that there be some change, that Ankara will be more willing to get more involved in the fight against ISIL in Syria? A very short answer, please.
I'm expecting that. But Ankara also will try to use this as a leverage in its strategic negotiations with US officials in its fights against PKK. So Ankara's strategic objective is to put the fight against ISIS and the fight against PKK in the same basket, which I also criticize to some extent. But this issue increases the Ankara's, how can I say, stakes and leverage points vis-a-vis the Washingtons.
Thank you very much. Metin Gurcan in Istanbul, Rebwar Fatah in London, and Mike Lyons in New York. Thank you all, gentlemen, very much indeed. And as ever, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. For more discussion, should you want it, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. There's also the conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. From me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.